Welcome to Connect Season 3. I know many of you were encouraged and blessed as you studied the names of God in Connect Season 2. I'm convinced that you're going to be really blessed and encouraged as you study the material that we've prepared for Connect Season 3. The theme this time is keeping the tank full. I don't know if you've ever been on a journey, car journey, perhaps on the motorway or on one of those back roads out in the sticks, and you've taken a look at the fuel gauge only to find that the needle is heading towards empty. It's only people who have been in that situation that can understand the feeling of dread that comes over you when you realise that you might soon run out of fuel. In the Christian life, we can easily run on empty. In fact, we can be running on empty and not even realise it. In these studies, we're going to look at how we can keep the tanks full and avoid running on empty. In the first session, we're going to look at keeping the faith tank full. And the study is based on Matthew chapter 14, where Peter walks on the water. I'm sure you're very familiar with the story. The disciples are out on the Sea of Galilee, and then suddenly a storm, as storms often do in the Sea of Galilee, came out of nowhere, and they find that they're struggling. And in the midst of their struggle in the storm, Jesus comes walking to them on the water. They're not sure what on earth is going on here. They think it might even be a ghost. And of course, out of all the disciples, there's only one who takes the initiative. Simon Peter says, "Jesus, if it's really you, ask me, invite me to come to you." And of course, Jesus says, "Come to me," and Simon Peter gets out of the boat and he walks toward Jesus. And everything's going well until Peter begins to look at the wind and the waves, and of course then he begins to sink. And Jesus picks him up and no doubt puts him back in the boat. There are a number of things that we can learn from this story of Peter walking on the water. The first thing is that sometimes it's in storms that our faith is ignited. Peter would never have walked in the water if he hadn't found himself in this particular storm. And sometimes it's when the storms of life come that we find that we really have to trust God, that we really have to believe Him. A second thing that we find in this passage is that faith rests on a revelation of who Jesus is. You know, if you want to build your faith, if you want to keep your faith tank full, one of the best things that you could do is simply to study the life of Jesus and the character of Jesus and what the Bible says about Jesus. A third thing that we find here is that faith also is activated by a word from God. Jesus says to Peter, "Come." And on the basis of Jesus' word, Peter begins to walk on the water. You know, I think sometimes some of the mistakes that we make with faith are when we just do things off our own bat, or we think we can do something and God hasn't actually spoken or God hasn't said it. Peter responded to a word from Jesus. And then of course we find that Peter actually had to take some action. Faith is incomplete without action. In fact, James, the Lord's brother, says, "Faith without works is dead." Peter had to take an action after Jesus spoke. Jesus wasn't going to walk on the water for Peter. God wasn't going to lift Peter up and set him on the water. Peter actually had to get out of the boat and step out in faith for himself. And then of course we find another principle here, that our faith tank drains when we take our eyes off Jesus. Peter was doing really well until he started to look at what was going on around him. You know, it's when we begin to look at what's going on around us and don't keep our eyes on the Lord that things really begin to go wrong, and we begin to get things out of perspective. And then I think it's important as well to look at how Jesus responded to Peter's doubt and lack of faith. Jesus pointed it out, but I don't think he did that in a harsh way or a critical way. I don't think he did it to condemn Peter. I think he was really saying, "Look, Peter, your problem was that you took your eyes off me, you began to doubt, and actually your faith wasn't all that it could be. Now, I don't think that that was the final statement on Peter's faith, because when we get over to the Acts of the Apostles, we find Peter healing the sick, we find miracles happening, we find him preaching the gospel, people being saved, we find God giving him some amazing revelations of what he wants to do. No, that scene on the Lake of Galilee wasn't the final act or the final episode in Peter's walk of faith. It was just a step along the way. And you know, if you've failed, or you've stepped out in faith and things haven't worked out the way that you'd hoped, or you took your eyes off Jesus, don't let that be the final episode in your walk of faith. Just be aware that Jesus wants to pick you up, get you back in the boat, and get you ready for another day, for another step of faith. So I hope that tonight, as you study keeping your faith time full, that you'll get your eyes fixed on Jesus again if you've taken your eyes off him. And if your eyes are on Jesus and you're really walking in faith, well, just keep your eyes on Jesus and be encouraged. God's with you. God's with all of us, and he wants us all to walk in faith, and he wants us all to have a faith tank that is full to overflowing.